I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.
Dear listeners, in the last episode, I mentioned that I would have a shocking admission on this particular podcast episode. And here it is. Are you ready, Lee?
No, but go for it.
Okay. You were right. I was wrong. Wow.
Hands on face,
Exactly.
doing his impression of the scream.
Yeah. Edvard Munch emoji. Now, the context of this, Lee, is that you and I did this short series on Song Dynasty poets. What started us off was we were originally just going to do an episode on Wang Anshi and one episode on Su Dongpo, also known as Su Shi. But we were having their poetry was interesting enough in comparison that we went, well, let's actually do a couple episodes, and that stretched into a whole Song Dynasty series. Now, at the time, because of time constraints, I wasn't able to translate a lot of this stuff on my own. I was just reading in translation. I was championing Wang Anshi as at least the more interesting poet. And you were insistent that no, it's got to be Su Dongpo. And I was like, no, I don't think so. Since then, I have had to translate Su Shi or Su Dongpo.
For your translation project.
Yeah, the translation I'm working on for the Xutang Library of Classical Chinese, which is an imprint of Oxford University. When I got to one of the poems by Su Shi, I started translating it and very quickly realized that Su Shi's poetry is in a very different class than most other classical poets. A lot of the poets I had to translate kind of before him. A little hard, right? I mean, you can't just take a classical Chinese poem and just translate it super quick, right? It's still kind of hard. But Su Shi took me days and days of looking at commentary and trying to think through lines. It was so much more complex and also so much more interesting. And that's when I had to, although it pains me so deeply to say this, it's when I had to admit, Lee was right. Wang Anshi is not nearly as good a poet.
This is a first time for everything.
There is a first time for everything. I'm not going to get used to it. I'm just saying,
We didn't really talk about this on the last episode, but we don't think that Zhang Jie's poem, the poem that we talked about last time, is a great poem.
No, we do not. And now it might be worth getting into why we don't think it's a great poem.
Before we do that, should we actually read the poem, the Su Dongpo poem?
Yeah.
If it's okay, Rob, I'm going to read my translation. So this is like the Zhang Jie poem. We're just titling it Water Dragon Chant. It seems like the poplar flower is and isn't a flower. No one cares if it falls down. It is tossed along the road home. It looks as if it has no feeling, but the flower can love. Being dumped on the road hurts it, makes it anxious. It casts those sleepy, flirty eyes. It wants to open, but stays closed. Dreamers follow the wind 1,000 miles, looking for a man, some even being aroused at the oriole's call. I don't grumble that this flower flies off so far. What pisses me off is, in the yard, the fallen flowers cannot be put back together. Dawn comes, the rain passes. What trace of the fallen flower will there still be? They will just be scattered across a pool full of duckweed. A flower is 3 parts, 2 parts dust, 1 part water. Look closely, and it is not a poplar flower at all, but rather the dripping of tears from a friend that's left.
Now, Lee and I, dear listener, are going to disagree. We may not actually discuss it because I don't want to get too much into the weeds about, this character clearly refers to, we may get into some of that. We're going to differ on word choice quite a bit in some lines, but I should point out that even the greatest English translation you're likely to read about Su Shi is not going to be able to really clue you into just how good this is in the Chinese.
The reason being because it's so elusive, and there's really no way to translate that elusiveness out of the original language. Su Shi is alluding to lots of different poems. He's using lines from earlier poets, and he's just kind of doing it without looking like he's trying.
And there's phrasing here that Zhang Jie could never have pulled off. The first couple of characters, this is the first time I think I've done this in the work I'm doing. I actually sent you a message saying, what do you do with this line? because even with commentary and whatnot, it was a killer. And I'm just gonna read it and then explain why it's so hard. It's 似花还是非花. Now, that, if you speak Chinese, you may catch that. But
I translated that as, it seems like the poplar flower is and isn't a flower.
And I translated it as poplars are like flowers and yet not like flowers. Now, literally, if you wanted to read those characters in a row, it would be like similar to or like flower. And then hai can be anything from also and huan. It's sometimes used in the medieval tradition as huan, like to turn around or something. So hai, let's say it's and. 是非花. Now, 非 is a negation, so not a flower. It is not a flower. But what does that mean? It's like a flower, 似花, but also like not flower. And if you understand those are poplars, even if you start off, and Lee and I both did, by saying, hey, these are poplars, still doesn't help you very much. What does it mean to say something is like and not like a flower? And that's just the first couple of characters. Nearly every line does something like that, and does it in a way that's both difficult to understand, but also immediately piques your interest, so you want to understand it.
And Rob, you pointed out to me when we were discussing this poem that one way to understand what Dongpo is doing is that he is alluding to this tradition that the poplar flower in Chinese poetry before Dongpo is not good enough to be regarded as a flower worthy of writing poetry about, right?
Right, which is where Zhang Jie was coming from as well, although arguably with a different kind of flower. But there is a whole class of flowers you're not supposed to write about, and the poplar is one of them. So that's both poets are taking a flower that you're not supposed to write about, and they're writing about it, and they're focusing on it being forgotten. Dongpo also has a reference to the Hanyu thought anyway. His is 无情有思. Now, you and I translate that a little differently, but the idea is simply that people think they're not worth writing about, they're not worth considering, but actually they have something, they have feeling, they have love, they have thought. So Zhang Jie and Su Shi are pretty similar here.
I want to just point out how they're different, though.
Yes.
So Zhang Jie has this reference to Hanyu, a Hanyu poem, but Su Shi is so dialed in that he actually has another reference to a different Hanyu poem at about the same point as in Zhang Jie's poem. So Su Shi is simultaneously referencing Zhang Jie's poem and a Hanyu poem, a different Hanyu poem. He's just operating on so many different levels.
Yes. Yes, he is.
Zhang Jie couldn't pull that off, right?
No, absolutely not. And in fact, doesn't even try. I don't think he was a good enough poet to even want to do that. One of the things that Su Shi does so much better here than Zhang Jie is walk this almost perfect tightrope between describing the flower as a flower and using the flower as a symbol or something to point to the kinds of people who are forgotten. Now, Zhang Jie just leans right into the person. In fact, my interpretation of that poem is he covers this forgotten woman in these forgotten flowers to remind you, hey, look, they're both forgotten. See, look. Whenever a poet has to signpost what they're doing, it's probably not the best poem. In fact, one of the things that Lee and I disagreed on was one of the lines where it's perfectly reasonable to read it as the poplars are dreaming something or that people are dreaming something. You can easily read it both ways, and that's such a masterful use of language where you can keep reading it exactly as you have with the poplar flowers, or you can take a slight left and take it somewhere else, but he doesn't take you there. He's going to make you go there if you want, but he's not going to signpost anything for you.
Rob, you're alluding to the line that's 蒙岁风万里, right?
Yeah.
So we actually had a discussion before the podcast about how to interpret that. The Baidu translation into contemporary vernacular Chinese translates Meng as not as dream, which is the character that's used in the poem, but as Meng Hun. The word Meng Hun could be translated as just kind of chaotic, a muddle, something like that. So there are really two ways to take that one word. It's not uncommon for classical Chinese poetry to take a word, a 字, a character, and have it just be a homophone for another character like that. But Dongpo doesn't really tell us where this interpretation should go. Should it go towards calling it a dream, or should it go towards calling it this kind of hubbub? You can go either way. That's what makes this poem so fantastic. In literary circles, we would say it doesn't foreclose on different interpretations. You can interpret it in a bunch of different ways. And Dongpo's genius is that he is able to kind of create different possible meanings that can kind of operate simultaneously. You can read it this way, and you're probably not wrong. But if you read it that way, you're also okay, right?
Yes, and he gives you these different layers even of perceiving the reality in the poem, where the line you just mentioned, the Meng Sui Feng Wan Li, is something is dreaming or caught in a muddle, something like that. And the very last part effectively is the oriole, or a version of that bird anyway, calling out. Now, why is the oriole calling out? You have this long thing involving either dreaming of or wishing someone far away was near. You're pining after a loved one. Again, you're not given a subject. You could easily read this as poplars or as somebody else. Fine. But the line ends with orioles. Now,
you're talking about the end of the first stanza, right?
End of the first stanza.
Not the end of the poem.
Right. There's so many ways you can go with that, but it's still a peculiar and almost fantastic set of images. It's like someone's caught up in a dream and then is brought back to earth cruelly by the call of this bird. Now, if you read that as a person, it makes sense. It makes sense, and it's sad. It's meant to be sad, right? If you read it as a poplar, it's more fantastic, but in the context of the stanza, it still makes sense, right? And just that one reference to the bird trips you up.
More so than English, Chinese poetry does not grammatically often require a subject. In fact, Chinese in general as a language tends to require subjects much less than English. And when you get into poetry, it's kind of all bets are off. The line itself is ying hu qi, and that could be, the bird, its call kind of rises, or it could actually reference being woken up by the bird's call. So if you want to go back to my interpretation of Meng as dream, then that works with that. But if you don't want to do that, then that line still kind of works. Again, there's just so much fluidity and so much you can do with a poem like this. The only thing it doesn't allow you to do is just to say, no, you can't interpret it that way, because there are just so many possibilities. I mean, if we were to interpret Su Shi as saying he's talking about Elon Musk and his rocket ship, I think we can kind of say not
probably
happening.
Not that.
But there's just so many different kind of ways you can interpret this that it's really a work of genius.
It is a work of genius. And this is though interesting. One of the problems with translating these poems is it's so unbelievably difficult to capture the kind of register they're writing in. And one of the problems I had when you and I were first talking about Wang Anshi and Su Shi was that the translations, plural, we were using can't help but kind of flatten them. So, okay, there are some differences, but they're not huge differences between the two in English, the translations we have. In Chinese, even the rhythm is different. Even the word choice is different. I think Zhang Jie's is it feels like a lot more adjectives. It feels like someone trying to over-describe something because they're self-conscious about how their lines are going to come off, so they're going to try to make them sound deep,
Which, if you are of the Hemingway school that adjectives and adverbs need to be eliminated to make good writing, just it points to the fact that Su Shi is better than Zhang Jie, which is what we've been saying.
Although I'm not a huge Hemingway fan, so anyway.
Whatever.
Yeah. Maybe I'll change my mind on that too someday. But anyway, what's important, though, is not necessarily that Su Shi doesn't use as many adjectives as Zhang Jie. It's that he mastered this balancing act between how to use something that's meant to symbolize something and the actual thing it's symbolizing, right? You can lean too far one way or the other. You can give people nothing, so they're like, oh, that's a nice poem about flowers. Or, like Zhang Jie, you can give them too much, where you go, oh, okay, I get it. It's about missing people and being forgotten. I got it, whatever. Su Shi's poem is one you come back to and come back to and come back to and go, wow, I hadn't noticed that. And this is just 8 lines of poetry. Well, 8 lines, if depending on how you print it, obviously. But yeah, it's a pretty stupendous thing.
Rob, can I ask you, so in my research on this poem, I was not able to find any connection between Su Dongpo and Zhang Jie. I mean, obviously he's alluding to Zhang Jie's poem, Su Dongpo is, but I don't know if they had like a social relationship or a personal relationship. I didn't, in my research for the podcast, I didn't find that. Do you feel like Su Dongpo was writing this poem just to show Zhang Jie that he could do so much better than Zhang Jie did? So we should point out that they're pretty much alive at the same time. I think Su Dongpo is about 10 years younger than Zhang Jie, and they die within 1 year of each other. Rob, do you think that Su Dongpo is just kind of showing him how to do it?
I don't know. Possibly. I don't know enough about Su Dongpo to say if he's the kind of arrogant type. The way I read it is Su Shi. You can't help but mix these names up, can you? I keep sometimes calling him Su Shi, sometimes Su Dongpo. The translation I was working on, he's referred to as Su Shi all the time, so that's the name that's in my head, but I just called him Su Dongpo. Sorry, dear listener, because that's going to get confusing. He's the same guy. The way I read it is that it's almost like Su Shi goes, oh, we're allowed to write about that now? I would love to write. I've always wanted to write a poem about like that, but I never bothered because sometimes it takes the person with no reputation who's kind of on the fringe to go, I think I'll write a poem about this. Why not? Let's go for it, right? Sometimes an established poet isn't really allowed to do certain things if they're going to stay established and sort of the top of their game. But to have someone beat him to the punch makes Su Shi go, aha, see, someone's already done this. So now I'm going to run with it. I've been wanting to for a while, so let's see what I can do.
Yeah, Rob, Su Dongpo and Su Shi, just keep in mind that that's the difference between his real name and his rap name. So you can call him either Chris Bridges or you can call him Ludacris, as he's better known.
Wow. See, it's
now we have our 1990s.
It's you making the musical references this time. I feel like our whole universe is upside down. I'm saying you're right about a poem and you're making music references. I mean, why am I even here today?
Rob, I think that's a great place to end it. If folks want to check us out on social media, where should they go?
If they weren't thoroughly bored by our discussion of poetry, I hope you weren't. This stuff is amazing. I hope you can go read it somewhere. If you're looking for more, Twitter, we are ChinLitPod. Instagram, we are Chinese Lit Pod. Patreon is just Chinese Literature Podcast. And of course, as always, Chinese Literature Podcast at gmail.com. Lee, Turnabout's Fair Play. We're going to post your translation on the website as well. That way we can possibly both get shredded by listeners in all fairness.
That would be great.
It actually would be great. Like if you've got a dead-on reading of this poem and you've researched it and you know what you're doing, we would absolutely
please send us
love
an
to hear
email at ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com.
Yes, please do. That would be fantastic.
Rob, it's hailing where you are. It just started hailing here where I am in Oregon. As we would say in China, 真有缘分. It must be destiny that we were to podcast together today at this particular moment. I'm going to sign off. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.